Badbird presents Seat of the Allfather. Written by J. Isaac. This is Episode 8, The Fast.
Max, stop that right now.
Max was in the kitchen eating an apple when Georgia suddenly appeared in the doorway. He froze, trying to figure out what he was doing wrong. He had wandered into the kitchen early that morning and found the table empty. He had scrounged around for a bit and found an apple for breakfast. Georgia shook her head and entered the kitchen.
Today is the start of our fast. Our next family night is very special, and we've learned that it is best experienced with a natural hunger.
Max set the half-eaten piece of fruit down on the counter and put his hands behind his back. Georgia scooped up the apple and tossed it into the trash.
It will only be for today and tomorrow. Trust me, it will be worth it.
Cold night had fallen over the countryside. Once again, the children lined up single file and followed Sully across the spacious lawn to the tree line. Max's stomach growled conspicuously. He had not eaten for almost 48 hours, save for a few bites of the apple the day before. He had never known that kind of pain in his stomach before. A gnawing, unrelenting sense of hunger that made him feel unhinged. From what he could tell, none of the other children had eaten either. The fire and torches soon came into view. As the procession entered the small clearing, Max noticed something else. There were two animals there, tethered to stakes in the ground. Chairs had been arranged in a broad circle around them. Max realized they were goats. Goats with dark brown hides sprinkled with small white splotches. They flicked their ears and looked up with curiosity at the group's approach. The night was silent, save for the loud crackling of the fire, and even the other children seemed unusually stoic. The youngest boy approached one of the goats and patted it on the head. To Max's surprise, he then bent over and pressed his face against the body of the animal. He seemed to be smelling, or perhaps kissing it. Georgia produced a bottle from the wicker basket on her arm. The bottle began to move around the circle. When it got to Max, he eagerly took a drink. He was hoping that the liquid would satiate his hunger, even for just a moment, but it only seemed to sharpen it. The sweet, spicy taste in his mouth was an unbearable tease. He began to feel intoxicated almost immediately. His balance began to degrade, and his vision blurred. As before, Georgia made an effort to excite the children. They sang songs and told jokes. Before the bottle was finished, Sully reached in and took it out of rotation.
That's enough of that for now. It's almost time.
Now that the excitement had paused, Max realized how dizzy he felt. Sully motioned for him to sit down in one of the chairs in the circle, and he gratefully complied. One by one, all the children and the two adults took seats around the two goats. Sully raised his hand slightly and announced that they would have a moment of peace before the beginning. Silence fell over the group as a breeze began to pick up in the forest. Max could feel it cooling the side of his neck as it moved through, his flushed skin tingling at the sensation. The forest sounds became more noticeable. Branches moving in the night, dry leaves crumpling from the movement of air, and the crackling of a waning fire, all of it began to take on an unsettling character. Max began to feel physically uncomfortable and longed for the opportunity to go back to the house for sleep. Everyone was deathly still. Then, Sully stirred.
Let's start.
James had made good time. The night before, he had slept for several hours at the hotel and then resumed driving. His travel through the night had placed him close to the city. Dawn was about to break, and James was alone on the road. He eyed his gas gauge and saw the needle bobbing just below the quarter-tank mark. James figured it would be better to fuel up before he got to the hospital. Likely as not, he would be right back on the road again if he was lucky enough to get any answers from Sarah. Presently, a grocery store and gas station became visible in the distance, and James slowed the truck to pull off. He was now on the outskirts of the city, and only 20 minutes from the hospital. At the store, there were only a handful of vehicles parked, a minivan at a pump, a truck, and 2 sedans near the front of the shop. James pulled in across from the minivan. There was a heavy-set, middle-aged woman gassing up at the van, and she eyed James as he exited the vehicle. James noticed that there was a man sitting in the passenger seat of the van as well. James began fueling his truck. Once the tank was full, he screwed the gas cap back on and went in to grab some food and a drink from the shop. When he exited, he noticed the male passenger had come from the van and was now engaged in an intense conversation with the woman. He was a husky man who looked to be in his 40s. At James' approach, they both grew quiet. The woman suddenly turned and began to approach him. She walked until she stood between James and his truck, forcing him to stop. James looked her up and down.
What?
Hi. I'm sorry to bother you, but my car won't start. It's that damn old battery. Is there a chance you could give us a jump? I would really appreciate it.
No, sorry.
James tried to walk around the woman, but she took several steps backwards and blocked him off again.
Please, it'll only take a minute. I need to get to my job.
James shifted the grocery bag to his right hand, using the other to point a finger at the woman's face. His jaw clenched.
Lady, get the fuck out of my way.
The woman's face flushed red and screwed up in anger. Suddenly, the sound of sirens could be heard. Piercing red and blue lights became visible several blocks away. James moved to his truck instinctively, trying to push past the woman in front of him. As he moved by, she grabbed onto his grocery bag and pulled, letting out a deafening screech.
Help! Help! Catch him! He's a killer! Help! Stop him!
As she screamed, the woman pulled viciously at the bag. Out of the corner of his eye, James could see people coming to the windows of the shop to investigate the sound. He pulled hard again on the bag, but the woman had a vice-like grip on it. James' vision blurred as rage coursed through his body. With astonishing speed, he suddenly released the bag and drove a right jab into the woman's larynx, making an audible crunching sound. She fell back with the bag in her arms and began writhing and gurgling on the ground.
Brittany! Brittany!
The male passenger started running over, screaming at the top of his lungs. On his approach, James juked left and kicked out the man's leading knee, causing him to fall shrieking to the concrete. A well-placed stomp made the noise stop. James swung into his truck and pulled out. He was able to make it out the back of the parking lot and halfway down the block by the time the squad cars pulled into the gas station. James shook his head and wiped a bead of perspiration from his forehead. His eyes had a savage, fiery glow to them.
Shit. If you were gonna call the cops, you should have told them to bring an ambulance.
Sully stood up from the chair and somberly took a position near the goats. His eyes roved over the faces of all those seated and then settled on Max.
What we're about to take part in is a sacred act. We're going to receive a new part of the allfather into us. For some of us, this will be a renewal. For you, Max, this will be an initiation. Watch and be receptive to the process.
Max swallowed, feeling his blood pressure rising. He was afraid. From his pocket, Sully pulled a cut of long, thin white hair. He separated the strands into 2 equal sections. Holding one in each hand, he knelt between the goats. The animals grew restless, pawing at the ground and straining at their tethers.
Shh.
Sully lowered his head until his face was pressed against the hide of one of the animals. He took a deep breath and then pulled away. He spoke quietly to the animals, in a voice so low the words could not be heard by those seated. Then, he held the hair out under the goats' mouths. Their eyes moved erratically as they chewed the hair, and they stamped with agitation. Sully gripped the backs of their necks and pulled their heads in close to his own. His lips curled, and a new melody came forth, a sad, desperate tune that seemed to fill the confines of the clearing like gas in a balloon. The goats jerked away from him, and they both moved away from each other, sitting back on their haunches. Sully backed off and took his seat again. A moment of silence passed. Suddenly, the first goat snapped upright. Its eyes rolled to the back of its head. It stood up and began to move about. But its movements weren't quite right. It moved in a jerky, stiff fashion, almost animatronic or puppet-like. The other goat snapped up and followed suit. Max's skin crawled. He had never seen anything like this before. Suddenly, one of the goat's eyes rolled back down into place and locked on the other animal. In a flash, it struck, teeth sinking into the other animal's back. The victim screamed in pain, and then its own eyes snapped into place. It clamped onto the side of its attacker's face. Before long, the 2 animals were locked in a wild, vicious combat, pulling strips of flesh off of each other and punching small, oozing holes in with their pointed hooves. They screamed, seemingly with savage delight, destroying each other's bodies. Soon, it was over. The battle ended slowly, with both animals falling onto each other to finish bleeding out. Large swaths of exposed, bleeding flesh covered what was left of their bodies. Tufts of hide and carnage littered the circle where they had fought. Silently, Sully stood to his feet and moved next to the fallen animals. All the others, save Max, followed suit. They knelt in a circle around the scene. Sully looked up at Max, who hovered on the periphery.
Max, come over here.
His voice was cool as ice water. The boy's heart was pounding. An urge to vomit was building in his gut. He shook his head instinctively. Sully's expression darkened.
Come here.
Max shook his head again. He wanted to run. But where would he run? He was trapped by fear.
I don't want to. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go home.
Sully stood up and approached Max. The boy looked up at him with tears in his eyes, and the man swung the cup of his open hand against his face. Max reeled back to the ground, writhing with pain. Stars of light crowded his vision, and all he could hear was his own heart beating like a war drum. Sully grasped the boy's lapel and drug him next to the still heaving animals on the ground. Holding the back of his neck tightly, the man bent low and spoke into his ear.
You are disrespecting the process. Fix yourself or I will fuck you up for real.
Max's eyes locked onto the goats. As one, all of those around the circle leaned forward and placed their hands on the bodies of the animals. They brought their heads down low, taking in the deep scent of the dying creatures. Max followed suit, internally recoiling at the feeling under his fingertips. The stench was overwhelming. He noticed that the other children were watching Sully intently, the way a cat watches a caged bird. Sully, noting their gaze, shook his head slightly. As Max devoted all of his strength to avoid vomiting on the group around him, something to his right caught his attention. The youngest boy was still down low, smelling the now dead goat. His eyes suddenly locked with Max's, and the older boy started. The child's eyes were alight with a savage glow, and a smile had spread across his face. The end of episode 8. This has been Seat of the Allfather. Join us next time for episode 9.